Nothing about this case exploded all at once. There were no sirens at the beginning, no frantic searches, no early warnings that demanded attention. What existed instead were reports that stalled, questions that softened, and a man who moved comfortably through the most powerful rooms in the world without attracting suspicion. People noticed patterns. Files were created. Testimony was recorded. But each time the truth edged closer to influence, the investigation slowed, then quietly stepped aside. By the time anyone tried to stop it, the system had already decided who it was willing to protect. This is the story of Jeffrey Epstein. Epstein did not arrive in elite society by force or spectacle. He arrived through permission. Born in Brooklyn, he began his career teaching math at a prestigious private school despite lacking the qualifications that position normally required. Even early on, he understood how legitimacy worked. If an institution accepted you, people stopped asking questions. Students later recalled how he singled out certain girls for attention, offering guidance and opportunity. Nothing overt. Nothing dramatic. Just enough to feel unsettling in hindsight, and easy to ignore in the moment. From there, Epstein drifted into finance, though the details of his success were always strangely opaque. He claimed to manage wealth for the ultra-rich, yet few could clearly explain how he made his money or who his primary clients were. What mattered more than clarity was association. Billionaires welcomed him. Politicians entertained him. Academics accepted his donations. Epstein placed himself just close enough to power that suspicion felt inappropriate. If someone questioned him, the answer was always the same: someone important trusts him. Behind that carefully cultivated image was a system built on access and silence. Teenage girls, many from vulnerable or unstable backgrounds, were recruited under promises that sounded harmless. A massage. Easy money. An introduction that might lead to something better. Once inside Epstein's properties, the rules changed. Boundaries dissolved. Abuse followed. And afterward, silence was expected. Some victims didn't fully understand what had happened to them until years later. Others understood immediately, but knew instinctively that no one would listen. What allowed this to continue wasn't secrecy. It was normalization. Staff noticed young girls coming and going. Drivers followed instructions without asking questions. Assistants managed schedules that never made sense. But when behavior exists inside wealth and authority, it stops looking criminal and starts looking like someone else's responsibility. Epstein didn't need to hide. He needed people to look away. That illusion cracked in 2005, when the parents of a 14-year-old girl reported sexual abuse at Epstein's Palm Beach mansion. Local police opened an investigation and quickly realized this was not an isolated allegation. Multiple victims came forward with nearly identical stories. Detectives documented recruitment methods, payments, and repeated abuse. The evidence was strong. The case was serious. And it was dangerous, not just for Epstein, but for anyone connected to him. Then something changed. The investigation slowed. Jurisdiction shifted. Meetings happened behind closed doors. The case moved from local authorities to federal prosecutors, where momentum quietly drained away. Victims waited. Evidence sat untouched. And in 2008, a plea deal was reached that stunned legal experts. Epstein pleaded guilty to minor state charges. In exchange, federal prosecutors agreed not to pursue trafficking charges, not only against him, but against unnamed potential co-conspirators. Victims were not informed until after the agreement was finalized. Epstein served just 13 months in a private wing of a county jail, allowed to leave 6 days a week for work release. Officially, it was a conviction. In practice, it was insulation. When Epstein was released, his life barely changed. He kept his money, his properties, and much of his social access. Universities continued accepting his donations. Influential figures continued associating with him. His conviction became an uncomfortable footnote, acknowledged but rarely examined. The system had closed the matter without resolving it. For the victims, the message was unmistakable. Their testimony had been enough to document abuse, but not enough to disrupt power. Justice had been negotiated around them. Epstein, meanwhile, lived with the confidence of someone who understood exactly how flexible accountability could be. For nearly a decade, he moved freely, traveled internationally, and hosted guests, operating as though the most dangerous moment of his life had already passed. And in many ways, he was right. His greatest protection was not money, but proximity. Information. The quiet understanding that exposing him would inevitably expose others. But silence eventually weakens. In 2018, investigative journalists revisited the Palm Beach deal, exposing how prosecutors had quietly shielded Epstein and his network. Public outrage followed. This time, it did not fade. Federal charges were filed. Epstein was arrested in 2019. Bail was denied. And for the first time in decades, the protection surrounding him appeared to collapse. It looked like the silence had finally ended. But instead, the story was approaching its most unsettling chapter. When Epstein was taken into federal custody in July 2019, everything felt different. This was no longer a case being managed quietly behind the scenes. The charges were severe. The attention was global. Cameras followed every movement. Epstein was denied bail and transferred to the Metropolitan Correctional Center in New York, a facility designed to hold high-risk detainees. For the first time, he was fully inside the system that had once bent around him. Inside MCC, Epstein's control evaporated. The man who once moved between private jets and gated estates now lived under constant observation. After an apparent incident, he was placed on suicide watch, then quietly removed days later. Officials described the decision as procedural. The consequences would later prove anything but. Epstein understood what a trial would mean. Discovery. Testimony. Names spoken under oath. Flight logs examined publicly. Financial records traced. Whatever leverage had protected him in the past was now dangerous. If he spoke, the fallout would be enormous. If he stayed silent, the trial itself would still expose how thoroughly the system had failed. Then came the early morning hours of August 10, 2019. Epstein was found unresponsive in his cell. He was pronounced dead shortly afterward. The official ruling was suicide by hanging. Within hours, the criminal case effectively ended. There would be no trial. No cross-examination. No moment where the full scope of his operation was forced into the open. Almost immediately, the failures became public. Guards responsible for checking on Epstein every 30 minutes did not do so. Surveillance cameras malfunctioned. His cellmate had been removed, leaving him alone despite prior risk assessments. Logs documenting welfare checks were falsified. Each failure alone might have been explained. Together, they formed a pattern too severe to ignore. Public reaction wasn't driven by speculation. It was driven by collapse of trust. The Justice Department later acknowledged serious irregularities. 2 guards were charged with falsifying records. The facility itself was already under scrutiny for understaffing and mismanagement. Epstein didn't just die in custody, he died inside a system already failing at its most basic functions. And with his death, the case narrowed. Before August 10, the investigation had the potential to expand outward, to recruiters, facilitators, enablers, and institutions that ignored warnings for years. After his death, accountability became diffuse. Investigations turned administrative. Reports replaced prosecutions. Responsibility dissolved into procedure. For the victims, the outcome was devastating. Many had waited years to confront Epstein. Some had only recently found the courage to speak. They were promised justice and instead received finality without answers. Civil lawsuits continued, but the man at the center, the one who could confirm, deny, or implicate others, would never speak again. Epstein did not operate alone. Girls were recruited, transported, and paid. Flights were logged. Properties were staffed. Money moved through carefully structured accounts. Yet years later, the number of people criminally charged in connection to his operation remains remarkably small. The system that failed to stop him now struggled to pursue those around him. What makes this case so unsettling is not mystery, but familiarity. Every stage followed a pattern seen before: warnings minimized, deals negotiated, oversight relaxed, consequences delayed. And when exposure became unavoidable, the story ended in a way that prevented deeper examination. Epstein's death allowed institutions to close the file without confronting how thoroughly they had failed. Reports were written. Reforms were promised. Apologies were issued. But the larger question, how someone like Epstein was protected for so long, was never fully answered. The case endures not because of unanswered conspiracies, but because of documented negligence. Because accountability stopped where it became inconvenient. Because silence was treated as stability. Jeffrey Epstein is dead. But the conditions that allowed him to operate, unchecked power, institutional deference, and strategic indifference, remain. And that is why this story still matters. Not because of how it ended, but because of what it revealed.